The prize was a joke. Everybody in Chadron, Nebraska knew it. At the volunteer fire department's spring pancake feed that year, they raffled off 3 things: a hunting rifle, a side of beef, and Lot 14, a rusted World War II Quonset hut on a weed-choked half-acre off Highway 20, with a county demolition order taped to the steel door in a plastic sleeve. When the fire chief read the last ticket, the woman who stood up was living in a Ford van behind the laundromat with her 12-year-old daughter. The room laughed. Somebody in the back actually applauded. 6 months later, nobody in that town was laughing, and the reason had almost nothing to do with the building. To understand that, you have to understand how she ended up holding that ticket. Her name is Nora Pike. She is 43, and for 16 years, she ran the scale house at the grain co-op on the east edge of Chadron. If you farmed in Dawes County, you knew her. The insurance covered her daughter's teeth and her daughter's viola rental. Then the co-op merged with an operation out of Scottsbluff and closed the Chadron scale house in a single memo. The memo did not use the word closed. It used the word optimized. She found work in under 2 weeks, which is the part people leave out around here. Maintenance for a chain of self-storage units, plus weekend shifts at the truck stop. Less money, but money. Then, 6 weeks in, she fell. A catwalk outside a storage unit, a patch of black ice under a light that had been out since Christmas, and about 11 feet onto frozen gravel. 2 cracked vertebrae. The surgery cost more than her van, and she was out of work 5 months. The bills did not wait. By spring, she was 11 weeks behind, on a rental on Bordeaux Street. The landlord was not cruel about it. He was a man with a mortgage of his own. He gave her 30 days, then 10 more, and then the sheriff's office posted the notice. She put what fit into a 1997 Ford Econoline with a bad alternator and no heater, and she and her daughter June drove out of that driveway on a Thursday in April. Here is what gets missed about homelessness in a place like Dawes County. There is no shelter system to fail you. There is nothing at all. The nearest emergency beds were 100 miles northeast in Rapid City, which meant pulling June out of her school, out of her orchestra section, out of the only town she had ever lived in. In a city, you get a bad option. Out there, you get no option, and then you get told you should have taken the option. So they stayed. They parked behind the laundromat on 2nd Street, where the owner let them use the bathroom and the outlet by the dryer vent. In January, at 9 below, they slept under 4 blankets and a wool horse pad, and Nora ran the engine in 20-minute intervals all night. June never missed a day of school. Not one. She did her homework in the laundromat on Sunday nights while their clothes went around, because the lot was empty then and nobody had to see. On cold mornings, she practiced her viola, fingering on the dashboard, with no instrument in her hands, left hand moving through the scales, right arm bowing air, while her mother scraped the inside of the windshield with a credit card. 19 months. That is how long they lived in that van. Which brings us to the 2nd Saturday in April, and a pancake breakfast in the equipment bay of the fire department. $5 gets you eggs and coffee on a paper plate between the engines. Nora took June because $5 fed both of them, and because June had asked, without making a thing of it, for something warm that was not from a gas station case. At the door, a volunteer was selling raffle tickets. Nora had exactly $5 left in her coat pocket, and she bought 1 ticket for the beef. 400 pounds of beef would have fed her daughter for a year if she could find somebody with freezer space and a reason to say yes. She did not win the beef. She did not win the rifle. She won Lot 14. Now, Lot 14 was in that raffle as a punchline, and everyone involved knew it. The county had signed the deed over to the fire department the year before, just to stop paying to mow the ditch approach, and somebody on the fire board suggested they raffle it off for laughs. That is the only reason real property ended up in a drawing between a rifle and a side of beef. 40 feet of corrugated steel curved like the top half of a barrel, thrown up out of military surplus around 1948, streaked orange with rust and chained shut. The demolition order had been taped to the door so long the paper had gone white. When the chief read her name, there was a 2-second pause while the room did the math. Everyone knew whose name that was. Everyone knew about the van behind the laundromat. And then the laughing started. A man named Delbert Hoyt, who ran the tire shop on Main, took a photograph of Nora standing beside the chief, holding that little paper ticket, and posted it that afternoon with a caption about how the homeless lady just became a homeowner. It moved around Dawes County for 3 weeks. For a while, people were calling her the Duchess of Lot 14. June saw that photograph. She was 12. That is the part Nora still will not talk about, and after you hear the rest of this, you will understand why she does not have to. Monday morning, Nora walked into the Dawes County courthouse and asked what she had actually won. The deed was real and recorded. Property tax came to $68 a year, with no mortgage and no back taxes, because the county had eaten those years earlier to clear the books. There was one condition. The demolition order stood. The structure had been declared unfit for occupancy in 2011, and Nora had 180 days to bring it up to habitability code, or the county would knock it down and send her the bill for the dozer. 180 days to make a condemned steel building fit for a child to sleep in, with no money for materials, no tools beyond a socket set in the back of a dying van, and nobody in that county she could reasonably ask after the week she had just had. She asked one question before she left. She asked who had the key. Nobody did. The building had been chained when the previous owner died, and as far as anyone at the courthouse knew, no one had opened that door in 22 years. Nora borrowed bolt cutters from the laundromat owner and drove out to Highway 20 that afternoon, with June in the passenger seat. They waded through waist-high grass, and she cut the chain off a building she legally owned and had never once been inside. The door was swollen tight in the frame. It took both of them, shoulders down, to move it. And then the light came in. The floor was concrete, poured, level and dry, with a drain set in the center. The steel ribs overhead were clean and unbroken, no daylight showing anywhere. Nora stood there a long moment, because the one thing she had braced for, the smell of rot, was completely absent. That building had been sealed so tight for 22 years that the inside was bone dry. Along the left wall, under a canvas tarp gone stiff with age, sat a metal lathe, a drill press bolted through to the concrete, and a welding table with a vise the size of a car battery. Wrenches hung on a pegboard in order of size, every one of them oiled and wrapped in newspaper from November of 2003. At the back, a cast-iron wood stove on a brick pad, and outside the rear door, buried under grass, a hand pump over a well drilled in the 1950s and never plugged. She had won a shop, dry, sound, insulatable, with roughly $12,000 in machine tools inside it, untouched for 2 decades, because everybody assumed the county had cleared it out years before. She thought that was what she had won. She was wrong about that. The thing that actually changed her life was still sitting in the dark inside a green metal footlocker under the welding table, and she would not open it for another 4 months. The man who left all of it there was named Walter Boyd. He welded in Chadron for close to 50 years, fixing hay rakes, cattle guards, and church railings, and he lived in the front third of that hut, behind a plywood partition. He died in the fall of 2003, at 79, with no wife, no children, and no will. The county chained the door, and every year after that the building slid further down the list until it was a joke. Nora went back to the van that night and did not sleep. She had 176 days left. The next morning she did the one thing that carried her through the whole summer. She drew a calendar on the inside of the steel door with a paint marker, 180 squares in 12 rows. She crossed one off every night before she slept. The first month was clearing and sealing, working off a borrowed ladder in 40-mile-an-hour wind. She hauled out 4 decades of scrap steel and sold it by weight for $340. The second month was insulation, and it nearly ended the whole thing. Curved steel walls do not take standard batting. She spent 2 weeks in the public library reading about vapor barriers before she landed on rigid foam board, cut into wedges and fitted rib by rib, then covered with barn siding off a collapsed dairy shed near Whitney. She cut every wedge by hand with a utility knife. 211 of them. June marked the count in the corner of each square on the door. In the third month, she got the wood stove running, and for the first night in 19 months, the two of them slept somewhere warm without an engine idling outside. She had almost quit twice before that night. Week 6, when a roof seam she had sealed herself let go in a hailstorm and dumped water across half the floor at 2 in the morning. Week 11, when the alternator died and the van got towed out to Lot 14, where it sat dead in the grass the rest of the summer. Both times, what got her back on the ladder was a door with squares on it and a child who could count them. Power was the one problem labor could not solve. The hardware store on Main opened an account for her one morning without being asked, and the invoice never came. She wired the entire building herself, off 2 manuals she found in a drawer under the welding table. Both were Walter's, both annotated in the margins in pencil by a man who had clearly taught himself the same way. Every circuit in that Quonset hut was run by a woman who had never wired anything in her life, reading the handwriting of a man dead for 22 years. June had a room by the end of month 5, framed out of salvaged 2x4s in the back third of the building, with a door Nora pulled from a demolition pile in Hay Springs. She built the bed out of the same barn siding, working on it only after June was asleep, which is why it took 6 weeks. The window was the hard part. Nora cut it through the steel wall with an angle grinder over 2 days, working from a chalk line, because she had worked out from the bed frame exactly where her daughter's head would be, and she wanted the Pine Ridge escarpment in that opening and nothing else. She did not let June in until it was finished. When she finally opened it, June walked in and stopped and did not say anything at all. She put one hand flat on the doorframe, the way you do when you are checking whether something is real. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, looked out at the escarpment going pink, and asked her mother whether she was allowed to close the door. 19 months in a van. There had not been a door to close. That was the question. Not the bed, not the window, not the walls. Whether she was allowed to shut it. Nora told her she could shut it whenever she wanted, then went outside and stood in the grass by the dead van for about 10 minutes before she trusted her own voice again. That is the part people expect to be the ending. It is not. Because a week later, clearing space for the bathroom, Nora slid a green metal footlocker out from under the welding table. Inside were Walter Boyd's papers, Navy discharge documents, a photograph of a young man in uniform standing in front of a Quonset hut in the Aleutian Islands, squinting into weather, and a hardbound ledger about the size of a phone book, filled front to back in careful pencil. It was not a business ledger, or rather it was, but only technically. Every page listed jobs Walter had done with the amount owed beside them, and next to hundreds of those entries, in the same careful pencil, were the same 2 words written over and over across 5 decades. No charge. A stock tank welded for a family in 1971. No charge. A wheelchair ramp built in 1984. No charge. 3 months of work on a church roof in Whitney, with a note in the margin that the congregation should keep its money for the heating bill. Hundreds of entries. 50 years of a man quietly not getting paid, on purpose, in pencil, where nobody would ever look. Nora sat down on that concrete floor with her back against the leg of the welding table and did not get up for a long time. June found her there coming in from the school bus, and the two of them went through it page by page until it got dark and they had to run the light. Folded twice inside the front cover was a letter Walter wrote in 1994, addressed to whoever came next. He wrote that he came back from the Aleutians in 1946 with nothing at all and slept in the back of a livestock truck through a Nebraska winter, and that a rancher named Emmett Doyle gave him the surplus steel and the half-acre and never once asked him for $1. He wrote that he had spent his whole life trying to pay Emmett Doyle back and never quite managed it. He wrote that the building was meant to be given and not sold, and that whoever ended up with it should understand that first. Nora Pike, sitting on a cold floor in a building the county had condemned, was reading a letter written by a dead man 11 years before her daughter was born, telling her she was the third person handed the same half-acre out of the same plain decency. If you have made it this far, hit subscribe. This channel exists to find these people before the record of them disappears into a footlocker, and there is a new one every week. Now here is where the town comes back in. Nora took the ledger to the Dawes County Historical Society because she thought somebody besides her should have a copy. A volunteer started reading entries out loud at the front counter, and within 10 minutes, they understood what they were holding, because the names in that book were the parents and grandparents of half of Chadron. The wheelchair ramp, built in 1984, was built for a woman named Ruby Hoyt. Ruby Hoyt was Delbert Hoyt's grandmother. Delbert Hoyt ran the tire shop on Main. Delbert Hoyt was the man who took the photograph and wrote the caption about the homeless lady becoming a homeowner. He showed up at Lot 14 on a Saturday morning with 2 employees, a compressor and a trailer full of tools. He made no speech about it. He asked what needed doing, and did it for 6 weekends straight. June was sitting on the concrete step by the door when his truck came up the approach. She was 14 weeks out from that photograph, and she knew exactly whose truck it was. She did not go inside. She sat there and watched him unload his compressor, and when he finally looked over at her, he nodded once, and she nodded back, and neither of them ever said a word about it. Nora watched the whole thing through the window she had cut for her daughter, and understood that something had just been settled that she had no part in. After Delbert, it was not just Delbert. The American Legion post dug the trench for the septic line. The high school shop class framed the bathroom as a class project. The county inspector came on day 172. He walked it for 2 hours with a clipboard, checking egress, smoke detectors, and wood stove clearance, and then signed the certificate of occupancy standing on Walter Boyd's concrete floor. There were 43 stars on that calendar door by then. June had started drawing them in the corners of the squares where something good had happened, without telling anybody she was doing it. A window cut, a door hung, the day the pump pulled clean water for the first time in 22 years. Nora has never painted over that door. She has been asked to. The 2 of them have lived in that Quonset hut for 2.5 years now. It has a mailing address, a front door with a deadbolt, and a wood stove she feeds every morning at 5:30. June is 15, plays viola in the school orchestra, and has never again had to explain to a teacher why her homework smells like a laundromat. Every Saturday morning, the doors of that building are open. People bring things that are broken. Mower decks, hay rake teeth, gate hinges, sections of wheelchair ramp rusted through at the joint. Nora fixes what she can and shows people how to fix the rest. She keeps a hardbound ledger on the welding table and writes the job and the amount in careful pencil. Most of those entries say the same 2 words Walters did. Somebody asked her once why she does not charge more, given how long she went without. She said a man she never met left her a shop, a well, a stove, and a letter, and the letter was the only part that actually mattered. There is one more thing. Taped to the underside of that green footlocker, in a plastic sleeve, is a letter Nora wrote in her own handwriting, addressed to whoever comes next. She has not told anyone what it says, including June, and she does not intend to, because it was not written for anybody currently alive to read it. Chadron laughed at Lot 14 for 3 weeks. Walter Boyd's ledger had been sitting in the dark for 22 years, in the same building, listing every reason they should have known better. Somebody in your town is sitting on a piece of property everybody has already written off. If you want to know what turns up when people finally go look, subscribe, because we go looking every week.